the speakers from this morning. All of the panels were fantastic, and I couldn't keep up with all of the connections that I felt like they were making with the ideas that I have for this paper. But I hope I hope they come to your mind too as I'm reading this. I want to thank in particular a big shout out to Matthew Kretcher for putting this together on the UWM side as part of the Serious Play team. He's sort of been the driving force behind this, but it's been a team effort. So thanks everyone from Serious Play and Game Worlds Collective. Okay, so my paper has this big long title that I hope we make some sense of, but I'm particularly interested in the idea of remediating the idea, the concept of the author, and sort of updating it maybe for you know, our world of participatory media. As Thomas mentioned, I'm a PhD candidate in English. My background is in the humanities, but in the course of the PhD program, I stumbled into some social anthropology through Serious Play and Thomas and the folks that I work with in there. And I really feel like that work sort of refracts my textual, rhetorical, and historical lenses that I see things through. And in particular, that, you know, just sort of learning that in their field, they sort of have to champion the text of the game itself. And in the humanities, it's always like, no, remember, there's also play going on. Remember, everybody, it's not just a book. So sort of seeing those two ends meet was a really sort of brainfold for me. And I try to work that through my work going forward. Speaking of that, this work comes from something I wrote before I was right after I graduated with the MA, actually. So I think it came out in 2016, but I think I wrote it in 2014 or something. So it's old, and I didn't feel like I quite said the thing that I was trying to say there. And rereading it, I could really sort of feel myself getting close to this idea, but I'm not very good at sort of pinning it down on the page. So what I'm wanting to do in this is maybe walk through it again and introduce some ideas that I've thought since then, and maybe just reconciling a little bit of this old idea with some new ideas. So the original problem I'm trying to tackle here is to somehow reconcile two concepts of the author that I see popular culture sort of displaying as illustrative of the independent game maker, and particularly things like Indie Game the movie. We can see Phil Fish here being suitably wacky for this sort of crazy experimental genius or whatever figure, and it really seems sort of like there is this binary, right? The gatekeepers of meaning, this rock star genius auteur. We could think Kojima or Miyamoto, or even somebody like Goichi Suda, maybe. And then on the other side, this invisible facilitator of the meaning making process. And this one's a little bit harder to name, but I'm thinking things like maybe Sid Meier. He's a star, of course, but we don't think of him as like, maybe not like aesthetically as a tourist, but more in the ways that his simulations sort of sell themselves as being a particular way. Paginov, maybe the inventor of Tetris. I don't think anybody can deny that Tetris is clearly sort of a shining example of game design, but no one really thinks, yes, the eye of Paginov, right? So this is where I'm at. I'm wanting to get at particularly how video games. Most of the sources that I'm bringing up, and that's not true. Some of the sources I'm bringing up refer to games in general, and I think for the most part that also applies to video games. But there's also things about video games that don't apply, that aren't backwards compatible to games at large, and I'm interested in sort of getting at that and how that figures into this idea of the author interface, or the author presence in a video game. I'm building on ideas of authorship and literariness, for that matter, as considerations of art, from French thinker Roland Barthes, famous for The Death of the Author, of course, which was essentially a hot take of its time. calling criticism aimed at author intention boring and lazy. And ultimately, the role of the author is in shaping possible interpretations. In his work, SZ, that's probably supposed to say that in a different way, but what have you. He sketches out readerly versus writerly text, right? Think about something like a stereo manual versus gravity's rainbows. Readerly texts are designed to push out meaning directly from the author. And I think a lot of realist texts did this, at the turn of the 20th century. Versus the writerly texts that produce a plurality of possible meanings. He says to interpret a text is not to give it a meaning, but to appreciate what plural constitutes it. And reading through SZ, which was written either in the late 60s or the early 70s, I can't remember off the top of my head, he almost seems to conceive of modern video games in this sort of plural texts where you can jump in at the beginning, middle, end, and everywhere. At the very least, hypertexts. Next, I turn to Alexander Galloway's work on the interface effect, in which he makes the claim that interfaces aren't things, but they are processes that produce a result of whatever kind. So, of course, we think of interfaces as being the screen, the keyboard, the monitor, but instead he's wanting to push our understanding a little bit further and think of it as an amalgamation of those things that produce a process. To illustrate this, he uses two pieces of visual art, Rockwell's triple self-portrait and the Mad magazine parody of it. In the first pic, we see Rockwell sitting in front of a portrait in progress, his back to the viewer as he gazes into a mirror, which is reflected back out to the observer. Notice how these three self-portraits create a closed circuit as the viewer's eyes move toward between the painter, the reflection, and the painting, noticing similarities and differences between the three. For instance, in the reflection, Rockwell's gaze is obscured by his gloss-covered glasses and his pipe sags in concentration, yet on the canvas, face enlarged twofold, his pipe juts out confidently and his eyes, sans glasses, address the viewer. These juxtaposed depictions provide a sort of foothold for making sense of it, for coming to some conclusion about authenticity in representations, for instance. In the Mad image, the artist still sits with his back to the viewer, but this time his reflection peers out to address the observer, and the portrait on the canvas faces inward, presented to the viewer as if from the viewer's own perspective of the back of the artist's head. It's a great sight gag, but as visual information, it puts all of the onus of making meaning of it on the viewer to get them to fill in the spaces left open by these incongruent edges. There's nothing but inconsistency here as we try to make sense of it. There's no logical sense. Galloway notes, quote, "The stress here is that one must always think about the image as a process rather than as a set of discrete, immutable items." End quote. Essentially, he's making a claim, and this is a very sort of microwave down, that a work's composition, particularly in the way that it discloses itself to the viewer, to the audience, affects a sort of prescriptive frame, and that this occurs processually and continually. It's not finished once the piece is finished. So in my original piece, I use Davey Wreden, Stanley Parable, and the Beginner's Guide as a way to try to show the way that I see this working in those two games. The Stanley Parable, I say, is very similar to the Rockwell painting, whereas the Beginner's Guide is closer to the Mad parody of it. Just a quick summary of the Stanley Parable, and I've actually gotten really good at this, and this is a really short summary of a very obtuse and hard to put in a box game. The Stanley Parable, a narrator navigates players as Stanley through a surreal story in an office building. Players have lots of opportunities to do something else, to the narrator's chagrin. Multiple endings, but each ultimately conclude with the player beginning the game again, back in Stanley's office. The end is never the end, is never the end, is never the end, which is a recurring sort of ticker you see on the loading screens as the game sort of switches back over to the start of the game. All of its edges, even the weirder ones, flow back to its center, a flow of return, which again pushes out to all edges that return back to the beginning. And it's, sort of, I think of it as waves because it's very rhythmic, particularly in the beginner's guide. Juxtaposition is the key machination here in the meaning-making process, and the interface of the thing, the way it operates to be interacted with, supports that to a degree. This is a very, very writerly text, Barthes would say. The beginner's guide is a little different. It presents itself as a straightforward linear story narrated by Davey, a fictionalized version of Wreden, who serves as the game's autobiographical narrator. The game is comprised of a collection of previously unreleased games made by an estranged acquaintance of Davey's, whom he calls Coda. The goal of the game, Davey tells players, is to get to know Coda by playing the games that he's made, hinting that there's a unifying theme in all of the seemingly desperate games, and that if players look hard enough, everything will become clear. However, players soon enough discover that Davey has been making changes to the games all along. Sorry, I meant to say spoiler alert. Usually in an attempt to provide cohesiveness or to create symbolism, and that this is actually the source of the strain on his relationship with Coda in the first place. The game ends with an ashamed, remorseful Davey. I put little scare quotes in there because who knows, hoping to reconnect with Coda. So on its surface, the beginner's guide is very similar to the Stanley Parable. It's a first-person walking sim narrated by a disembodied voice that leads players to the game's spaces. But this is where the similarities seem to end. This game is linear, and players are relegated to a more cinematic mode of engagement. That is, players are extra diegetic agents. They're not part of the story. They're just there sort of as ghosts, whose sole responsibility is to receive the narrative information. They have no surrogate, a la Stanley, through which to enact any agency in the game. This game lacks the door on the right. There are no opportunities for a player to break away from the narrative as it's presented. If the Stanley Parable is an open house for players to peruse at their leisure, then the beginner's guide is a regimented guided tour that a player either follows to the end or departs from prematurely, but cannot alter. Or at least this is how it initially presents itself, as a readerly text through which meaning is dispensed. Like the mad portrait, every ounce of energy within it is aimed at its own externalization. And that's a quote from Galloway at the end there. End quote. However, my argument here is that Wreden's implementation of a stronger authorial tone in the beginner's guide does not repress the interpretive potential of the game, but rather facilitates that plurality of meaning indicative of the writerly text. The game's anti-ludic design elements and Wreden's metaleptic inclusion of himself as the narrator of the game are just some of the ways in which the game positions player into a particular mode of interaction with it, what Catherine Hales would call deep attention. Thoughtful, reflective, meditative even. A way of being that one perhaps inhibits when being a good listener. And importantly, this thing is a participatory process that is never stable and is still nonetheless prescriptive to some degree. What I take away from this, and what I don't think very successful in getting across in the first article, was that this kind of verbal or discursive mode, what I'm calling the author interface, within video games can affect the procedural modes just as they are affected by them. Okay. I think I'm running short on time, but I'm almost done. So one of the new pieces that I've encountered recently, and this one just sort of explodes all over my work, I keep coming back to it, is C Thi Nguyen's Games Agency as Art. I should have put the cover on here. But he writes about games as artifacts with which we are able to inscribe forms and expressions of agencies. To start with, I want to note that he is talking about particular games. He actually starts with a sort of analysis of Bernard Suit's analysis of games. And it's widely known that Bernard Suits is particularly narrow in his scope of what he considers games. But that doesn't mean that it's not completely useless, because he's very good at describing those types of games. What Nguyen does is uses Suits' ideas of striving play, or maybe it's achievement play, I can't remember, but he splits them into striving and achievement. And for Nguyen, basically what that does is to illustrate the ways that games allow us to split our goals and our motivations, showing that we are sort of agentially flexible in what we can strive for. In striving games, we strive to play. In achievement games, we strive to win. So something like gambling would be, of course, achievement. You're not necessarily going to let someone else sort of catch up with you just for the sake of keeping the game going and having fun. What Nguyen is particularly interested in is the aesthetic striving game, games that derive their aesthetic pleasure from the playing of it, the striving of it. And importantly, he notes that in games like this, the artist's work, the rules, the architecture for play, and the attentive focus, the player's own actions, are separate. And that's pretty rare for works of art, right? Typically, when you make a painting, the attentive attentive focus is the painting that you have created. Maybe not necessarily the actions of the eyes of the person viewing the painting, although who knows. All
right, I think we're about at time. So okay, just want to quickly wrap up.
Sure, yeah, let me push through. Essentially, this is the idea that the games are a medium of agency, and that game designers are essentially working with agencies to produce aesthetic results. Remediating the author, concept that acknowledges both the participatory nature of the text as well as its careful composition. I am starting to think more about the author interface as a verbal semiotic mode of video games that attempts to create alternating flows of localization, the Rockwell's painting, and externalization, the Mad parody, within the meaning-making process. So this sort of switch between you figure it out and I'm telling you. And that aligns with Hale's oscillation between a deep and hyper attention too. In the beginner's guide, Davey's narration is perhaps an obvious instance of the semiotic authorial presence for our undertaking of the procedural elements of the game, operating as a prescriptive frame for our undertaking of the procedural elements of the game. Specifically, the way that Wreden configures the experience so that Davey seems to do us a favor by unlocking the gate or speeding the stairs up. These moments highlight the dual nature of video game authorship, the semiotic and procedural, and illustrate how the relationship functions for a video game. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ryan. Great, let's move on to our second paper today. This is from Joey Lara.